Good evening and welcome back to my channel, The Shadow Fox. I hope everyone's coping well with the heat we're having at the moment. It's a nice quiet night tonight, so I thought I would dig into one of my books and read 3 short ghost stories. I have my toffee and macadamia nut mocha to keep me going throughout. So let's start. This first one is called The Barons Banshee. Among Gaelic people, banshees, female guardian spirits, have been well known for centuries. A banshee will attach herself to a person or family, watch over them during their life, and foretell an imminent death by shrieking, crying and wailing. Such is the case with the Rossmore Banshee of County Monaghan, Ireland. Her terrible wailing was first heard in 1801. General Robert Cunningham, the first Baron Rossmore, lay dying. William Rossmore, the 6th Baron, described the original appearance of the Banshee, a story passed down through the family over the years. Robert Rossmore was on terms of great friendship with Sir Jonah and Lady Barrington, and once when they met at a Dublin drawing room, Rossmore persuaded the Barringtons to come over the next day to Mount Kennedy, where he was then living. As the invited guests proposed to rise early, they retired to bed in good time and slept soundly until 2 o'clock in the morning, when Sir Jonah was awakened by a wild and plaintive cry. He lost no time in rousing his wife, and the sacred couple got up and opened the window, which looked out over the grass plot beneath. It was a moonlight night, and the objects around the house were easily discernible, but there was nothing to be seen in the direction whence the eerie sound proceeded. Now thoroughly frightened, Lady Barrington called her maid, who straightway would not listen or look, and fled in terror to the servants' quarters. The uncanny noise continued for about half an hour, when it suddenly ceased. All at once a weird cry of Rossmore, Rossmore, Rossmore was heard, and then all was still. The Barringtons looked at each other in dismay and were utterly bewildered as to what the cry could mean. They decided, however, not to mention the incident at Mount Kennedy, and returned to bed in the hope of resuming their broken slumbers. They were not left long undisturbed, for at 7 o'clock they were awakened by a loud knocking at the bedroom door, and Sir Jonah's servant, Lawyer, entered the room, his face white with terror. "What's the matter? What's the matter?" asked Sir Jonah. "Is anyone dead?" "Oh, sir," answered the man, "Lord Rossmore's footman has just gone in by great haste and has told me that my lord, after coming from the castle, had gone to bed in perfect health, but that at about 2:30 this morning, his own man, hearing a noise in his master's room, went to find him and found him in the agonies of death. And before he could alarm the servants, his lordship was dead." Shrieking and wailing and crying, "Rossmore, Rossmore." The Banshee has announced the death of every Rossmore heir since then, including that of the 6th Baron, who died in 1958. So that's the story of the Banshee. Fascinating tale. The next one is called Marker 239. In the late summer of 1929, a new highway was opened to traffic between Bremen and Bremerhaven, Germany. Within a year, more than 100 automobiles had crashed mysteriously on the highway, all at kilometre stone 239, on a perfectly straight stretch of road. When questioned by the police, survivors described feeling a tremendous thrill as their cars reached the marker, and said that some great force then seized their vehicles and pulled them off the road. In a single day, September the 7th, 1930, 9 cars were wrecked at the fateful marker. The police and other investigators were puzzled, but a local dowser, Carl Wares, suggested that the mysterious force was a powerful magnetic current generated by an underground stream. To test his theory, he took a steel divining rod in his hands and slowly walked toward marker 239. When he was directly opposite it and about 12 feet away, the rod suddenly flew out of his hands as if flung by some invisible force to the other side of the road, while Wares himself was spun halfway around in his tracks. Satisfied that his theory was correct, Wares applied his own solution to the problem and buried a copper box full of small star-shaped pieces of copper at the base of the stone marker. The box remained buried there for a week, and during that time no accidents occurred. The box was then dug up, and the first 3 cars that passed the marker were wrecked. The box was quickly reburied, and since then there have been no accidents at kilometre marker 239. Although Carl Wares made his living as a water diviner and presumably knew something about underground streams, local farmers believed that a devil was responsible for the accidents. They said that after it had been exorcised from the road, it entered their radios, which henceforth produced nothing but static. A really, really fascinating story. It's not the first one I've heard as well about road markers and these eerie coincidences that seem to be drawn to them. Now this next one is the longest. It's called the Haw Branch Hauntings. At one time, Haw Branch Plantation, not far from the small town of Amelia, Virginia, spread over more than 15,000 acres, and the manor house with its tall chimneys, dry moat and numerous outbuildings was one of the gems of antebellum architecture. As the years went by, though, the estate was reduced. The house fell into disrepair and the gardens and rolling lawns became overgrown. Then in 1964, Carey McGonaghy and his wife Gibson bought the property. Mrs. McGonaghy's grandmother had lived at the house many years before, and Gibson had visited the place when she was a child. But for 50 years, no member of her family had occupied it. By August the 13th, 1965, the house had been restored to the point where the McGonaghys could move in. After 4 years of hard work, the place had regained its old style. And in 1969, an elderly cousin gave Gibson a present, a large portrait of a distant and long-dead relative named Florence White. All Gibson's cousin could tell her was that the portrait had been done at a summer home belonging to the Wrights in Duxbury, Massachusetts, and that Florence had died suddenly just before it was finished, when she was still a young woman. He added that the portrait was in pastels and was beautifully coloured. When the McGonaghys had uncrated the portrait and cleaned the glass, they were astonished to see that the work was in charcoal. Instead of the glowing pastels they expected, they saw a composition of blacks, greys and dirty whites. Despite their disappointment, however, they hung the portrait over the library fireplace. A few days later, when Mrs. McGonaghy was in the basement, she heard women's voices coming from the library, and supposing that some friends had arrived unannounced, she called out, "I'm coming right up," and went upstairs. She continued to hear the voices until she was just outside the library door, at which point they stopped. The room was empty. She looked through the rest of the house but could find no one. A few months later, in February 1970, Carey McGonaghy was sitting in the library reading the newspaper when he happened to look up at the picture of Florence Wright. If his eyes were not deceiving him, past a painting of a rose standing in a vase on a table near the young woman was no longer a muddy grey. It was slowly turning pink. He got up to study it more closely. Not only was the rose gaining colour, but Florence's formerly charcoal black hair was lightening. Her grey skin was taking on the hue of living flesh. and colour was creeping into almost every grey and black tone in the picture. In the days following, the colours grew more vivid. From time to time, women's voices were heard in the library, but no one was ever seen there. In a few months, the portrait was fully transformed, revealing Florence Wright as a blue-eyed, red-haired girl sitting in an upholstered green chair. The vase in the painting turned a pale jade green, and the rose in it a soft pink. Once the portrait's transformation was complete, the McGonaghys no longer heard the sound of women's voices in the library. According to a local clairvoyant who had heard of the portrait and examined it, Florence's spirit was locked in the picture because she had died before it was finished. But she had the power to drain it of all colour if she did not like the place where it hung. To restore the colour, she had enlisted the help of 2 other spirits, and theirs were the voices that they heard. If the spirit of Florence Wright was content at Haw Branch, some other entities seemed to have been far from happy there. 3 months after they moved in, on November the 23rd, 1965, the McGonaghys were awakened by a woman's scream. It seemed to come from one of the floors above them, and they rushed upstairs to investigate. Their children were standing at the foot of the stairs to the attic, and said that was where the scream had come from. The family's 2 dogs seemed terrified. Nobody investigated the attic until daylight, and when they did, they found nothing was wrong. 6 months later to the day, the McGonaghys again heard the blood-curdling scream, and again found no source for it. This happened twice more, again at 6-month intervals, on November the 23rd and May the 23rd, when the screams were replaced by the apparition of a young woman. She was first seen by Gibbs and McGonaghy in the summer of 1967. I could plainly see the silhouette of a slim girl in a floor-length dress with a full skirt. It was not the wide fullness of a hoop skirt, but one from an earlier period. I could see no features, but she was not transparent, just a white silhouette. I saw her for perhaps 10 seconds. In the next instant, she was gone. There was no gradual fading away. She simply disappeared from one instant to the next, they said. Several nights later, one of the McGonaghy's daughters was kept awake by the barking of the family dog on the porch, so she let him in. The animal instantly ran past her, towards the drawing room. When I looked into the drawing room, the girl said, Blackie was sitting there, wagging her tail, and looking up at a lady in white, who was standing in front of the fireplace. Before I could say anything, the lady disappeared right in front of my eyes. When the McGonaghys discussed the lady in white with other members of the family, they discovered that she was no newcomer to Haw Branch. Harriet Mason, their great-grandmother, had spoken of seeing her, and told how the apparition had once touched her, awakening her from a deep sleep. When November the 23rd came again, the McGonaghys prepared for the anticipated screams, sitting up from midnight to dawn with flashlights and a tape recorder. They heard nothing. On May the 23rd, 1968, they again sat up all night. This time they heard heavy footsteps crossing the yard, and Mr. and Mrs. McGonaghy quietly went out onto the porch to look around. There was nothing to see, but they heard heavy, running footsteps, and then, a few seconds later, a call from behind the barn. Next morning, Mrs. McGonaghy said, our son and daughter reported that they saw a giant bird standing in the yard, in the moonlight under their windows. He was standing there with its wings spread out, appearing to have a wingspan of over 6 feet. The bird itself was never seen again, but the unearthly screech was heard again on the 23rd of May and November several more times. The woman's scream was never heard again, nor was she seen, but other curious things occurred in and around the old house. Sometimes, for example, the scent of roses or oranges would pervade the rooms, though there were no roses or oranges anywhere in the house. There were also inexplicable noises sometimes. The heavy thud of something falling into the moat and the sound of cowbells circling the house at night. No source was ever discovered for these sounds. Another time, what seemed to be a man with a kerosene lantern came out of the barn and approached the house. As he went by the porch, the McGonaghys saw the light bobbing and swaying in the air, but no one carrying it. No ancient, sinister or tragic source has so far been discovered for the Haw Branch Hauntings. So that was 3 very interesting tales of hauntings, and some that aren't that old, I mean from the 1960s as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you would like me to do another video where it's just me chilling and reading some stories from the book. Thank you for listening. Do like and subscribe. Good night.